Thank you for listening to Gunplay Thunder, a Wild Western short novella. Hit the subscribe button above and leave a comment below so we can bring you even more audiobook adventures. Chapter 1. Rip Campbell, outcast and fugitive from the law, halted Beans, his horse, for some reason which he himself couldn't have explained. It was probably one of those hunches that so often come to men outside the pale. He rubbed the alkali dust from his boyish blue eyes and stared southward along the waterless twist of the arroyo that followed the mountain. Above, looking like the ribs of some prehistoric monster, was a treeless cliff, the gaunt backbone of one of Arizona's nameless mountains. Nothing stirred. All was as hot and lifeless as the inside of a blast furnace. Then came a puff of wind, hardly a hatful, scarcely enough to stir the uneven sand. The beautiful but cruel wand of a devil's coach whip bent a little, and that was all. That is, at first Campbell thought it was all. Then something went whirling over a bare patch, something that seemed to be only a bit of green and yellow paper. The outlaw's eyes narrowed. There is something about money not easily imitated, even at a distance. Bending low in his saddle with practiced skill, he picked it up with the tips of his fingers. It was a $20 bill. "Are we dreaming, Beans?" he muttered with a low whistle. The black and white spotted pinto twitched its sensitive ears. Unless it was a daydream, induced by the steady white glare of the sun, there wasn't much chance of that. The banknote was real enough. The youthful outlaw looked keenly about him. The wilderness seemed as desolate as ever, yet not 20 yards from him, caught in a bunch of prickly pear, yellow side out, was another bill. It was a 50 this time. Rip raked back his dusty Stetson and scratched his curly head reflectively. This was beginning to look like real money. A new sort of gold mine. Yet, although the man didn't have 2 thin dimes in his pocket to rub together, he felt a strange feeling of panic. This wasn't his money. It didn't belong to him. This might seem a weird worry for an outlaw and wanted man to entertain. But Rip, although his life was already forfeit through fights where bullets had proved a bit too deadly for the other cowboy, was not a thief. He had been always careful, too, with his branding irons. Almost every sheriff in the Southwest had called him a killer, but few had ever called him a rustler. Even the wolves of his kind, running in death-dealing packs, had snapped at his heels with contempt for being a good outlaw. $70 was quite a stake for a homeless wanderer in search of an honest range job. It was a temptation, too, for he was only human, and hadn't the desert given it to him? Hadn't the wind blown it from nowhere into his hand? Before going another 50 yards, Rip had collected $230 in all. The bills seemed everywhere, in every out-of-the-way place. He found one 20 half buried in the sand, one comber sticking up. Another was tumbling through the tall, waving grass. Gradually, the money trail was leading him toward the bottom of the smooth granite precipice. He was still wondering, and occasionally picking up a 10 or a 5, when he saw a buzzard suddenly rise ahead of him like a flying bald-headed old man. That doesn't mean anybody any good, the outlaw thought as he pressed forward. But he was hardly prepared for the scene of horror that met his eyes a few moments later. At the bottom of the cliff, where they had fallen together to their deaths, were the bodies of a man and the horse he had been riding. As Rip watched, a second buzzard, larger and more sinister than the first, rose from the head of the dead man and swooped upward, its naked skull and crimson beak gleaming in the sun. That in itself was terrible enough, but Rip Campbell's eyes widened when he saw that the man was almost a counterpart for himself. He had the same kind of outfit, brown leather chaps and a shirt of blue and white, laced single-breasted at the neck. Even the dead horse was much the same as Beans, being a spotted pinto, although of larger size and coarser of bone. Also, it had a pure white head and neck and white stockings. Rip looked again. He saw that the dead man had been killed by the terrible plunge from the 1,000-foot precipice above. His face, or what he could see of it, was more than a dozen years older than Rip himself, being past 30. He had been riding, it appeared, with his blue bandana pulled up over the lower part of his face, but the fatal fall had loosened it, disclosing a hard, evil face that even death couldn't soften. His guns were still in their holsters, although the impact had been enough to break almost every bone in his body, as well as in that of his unfortunate pony. At first, I thought it was me, Rip muttered aloud, with a feeling of awe, not stopping to think how loco the observation sounded. It was peculiar, though, how near his outfit was like that of the dead man. About the only difference besides the age gap was in the saddles. Rip Campbell's was well cared for and trimmed with silver, while the other hull was broken and shabby, although the fall might have done that. All about the scene of the tragedy were bills of the same denominations, showing where the money had come from. There were many 20s and 50s, and even a few $100 bills. This was due, apparently, to the awful force of the tumble from the heights, for the dead hombre's elk hide vest had been ripped from top to bottom, and it had been here he had been carrying the small fortune in bills. Rip counted what he picked up, and discovered that it amounted to an even $4,000. This seemed to be all of it. The outcast looked thoughtfully at the ruin of what had once been a living, breathing man. Somehow, he didn't believe that this money belonged to the dead man. Probably it was the scowling, unpleasant appearance of the now stiffened face that led him to think it. Had retribution overtaken this unknown? Had destiny stepped in to even crooked accounts? "Well, Beans, let's be hitting the trail," the outlaw said softly. "We'll never know by standing here looking at it. Maybe someday we can return this buzzard money where it belongs. In the meantime, we're not going to touch one blood-stained bill of it." Rip Campbell shut his clean-cut mouth with a firm snap and clucked his horse forward. Chapter 2. Lizard Sink was one of the hottest stretches of desert between the Nueces and the Gila, which is saying a lot. In all its 42 miles of sun-tormented heat and fury, there is but one water hole, and that is often only a muddy, half-dry shambles, trodden down by the hoofs of famished cattle and poor starved beasts of a wilder and cruder range. Wild mustangs trampled it. Coyotes lapped at the bitter water when there was water, and howled plaintively by night. It was 10 in the morning. The distant blue hills were lost in the glaze of flickering horizons. The desert was as silent as a tomb. Not even a raven was in the yellow, copper-colored sky. But by the water hole, a group of a dozen horsemen were waiting. The heads of their mounts were down, as they gazed eagerly at the 6 by 20-foot pool of stagnant water that occupied a little depression among the baking rocks. Their masters held them back, sawing at their reins with an occasional oath. "It's hotter than $700 and 2 bits change," growled Sheriff Starr disgustedly. "If we're going to chase wild geese, let's chase them up where it's cooler." "But you was so dang certain that this wasn't going to be no wild goose chase," objected Cade Sutter, his best deputy. The sheriff sighed. His face looked exactly like cooking beefsteak. Even those pepper and salt whiskers carried out the illusion. "I still think we'll catch the bastard we're after," he admitted. "Hang it all, Campbell has got to come this way for water. Nobody and nothing can live long without water in this sink. I reckon you know how hard it's going to be to catch this Campbell kid," put in another of the deputies with an air of gloom. "There's been a dead or alive offer on that outlaw for a long time, Chief. $1 to 2 bits we don't nab him." "I'll take the bet," said the sheriff. "Sooner or later, no matter how lucky or how clever he is, an outlaw rides plumb to a fall. That's what's going to happen today. What do you think?" He turned to a silver-haired man astride a saddled roan. "We've got to get him." Cook's words came in a sob that was almost a prayer. "I can't afford to lose that $4,000. If I do, I'm ruined. Times is hard. I'll lose my ranch and the work of years." "The coyote," snarled one of the other men. "Never you mind, Dad, we'll get him," spoke up young Bob Cook. "We'll get him. I don't know whether it'll be dead or alive, but we'll make him pay for what he done." He spoke with all the impetuous fierceness of youth. He was only 25, but with his long lower jaw, his bleak gray eyes and overhanging lock of colorless hair, he looked almost the picture of his father, Owens Cook, the owner of the YB Ranch. "We'll get him alive," announced Sheriff Starr firmly, "unless he puts up a whale of a fight. Killing's good only when it's necessary, and I'm an officer of the law." It was easy to see that Starr was square. He was not, however, weak. He had the dogged grit of a man who never forgets. The fact that Starr had a generous portion of Osage stock in his makeup had much to do with that. Right now, his jaw was thrust out until his massive underjaw was even with the end of his stubby nose. "Of course," said a new voice with an easy chuckle, "I'm not personally interested in the case like the Cooks here, as far as that goes. If I was a businessman first of all, and a man afterward, I wouldn't care if that 4,000 never did show up." The speaker was James Simpson, one of the most influential landowners in the La Osa Basin country. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dark. Rumor had it that he was a fighter, and that he had broken a man's back with his bare hands once in the Tin Palace Saloon in La Osa. His slightly upturned mustaches, always carefully trimmed, gave him an expression that seemed a continual, half-mocking grimace. Everyone in the district, though, respected James Simpson. He had that thing that brings power, if it does not always bring happiness and peace of mind: money. "That's right, Simpson," agreed the elder Cook, turning to him. "If I lose that money, you come into the box, YB. I needed every cent of that stolen money to pay off the mortgage." "I'm not worrying, Owens Cook, you old rascal," said Simpson, showing his pointed teeth jokingly. "Your ranch is worth more than 4,000, and I know it." "Thanks, friend," sighed Cook, extending his arm to shake Simpson's hand heartily. "You're a real stand-up man. The fact that you're here helping proves that." Simpson had donated 4 of his men to the manhunt. All were reputed the best and deadliest shots in La Osa. Sheriff Starr had 3 of his usual deputies, and 1 posse man who had been sworn in for the day's job. Cook and his son Bob made up the rest of the formidable party. It would be a clever and wise fugitive, indeed, who could hope to escape such a set of gunmen. 12 of us," muttered the sheriff. "When Campbell comes here for water, he'll have his last drink. Hadn't we better scatter out some and sort of hide out among these rocks around the water hole?" was Deputy Sutter's suggestion. The sheriff drew the makings from his breast pocket, rolled a brown cigarette, and applied a match. The result in that heated air was so far from cooling and satisfying that Starr gave a grunt of disgust and spat it out unsmoked, leaving the round tag of his making sack to dangle from his shirt. "I reckon that'd be very good," he approved. "Though Campbell ain't going to get away if he heaves in sight. Remember that big silver against them 2 little bits we don't nab him," reminded the gloomy deputy. "It's still a bet," grinned Sheriff Starr. "All right, fellows, let's scatter out some." They dismounted, some taking positions near the muddy water hole, and others stationing themselves behind boulders and slabs of the lava rock that littered the desert. The sheriff lined out his force with such care that soon 2 wild horses came down to the little pool to quench their thirst without even sensing the presence of enemies. Then a period of careful, nerve-wracking waiting began. Hours seemed to pass, hours that were really only minutes. Then from one of the deputies came a little faint call, like that of a desert bird. A rider was approaching from the west at a swinging pace. Already they could see the powdery dust he was raising. "A black and white spotted horse," whispered Sheriff Starr at length. "Don't anybody move until I sing out." Another 10 minutes passed. It was evident that the outlaw was coming straight for the water hole. A dozen guns came quickly and noiselessly from their holsters. The steady clop-clap of hoofs became louder, closer. Suddenly, the sheriff and half a dozen of the others jumped from their hiding places. Gun hammers clicked back like the machinery of doom. "Stick up your hands, you thief!" Star bellowed. "We've got you, Rip Campbell, and we've got the drop." Chapter 3. Rip Campbell found himself covered by a dozen relentless guns. Ordinarily careful, he hadn't expected to be waylaid that way, and at such a place. It was bitter medicine to be trapped like an animal at the only life-giving spot on Lizard Sink. Quietly, and because there was nothing else for him to do, he thrust his empty hands aloft. There was an elated cry from the manhunters. James Simpson, guns in hand, was the first to jump from cover. Then the sheriff, then his deputies. "Well, we've got him, just as I said we would," Star chuckled. "How about paying me that silver peso, Dundee?" A faint smile dispelled the gloom from the lanky deputy's face for a moment, as a silver coin was flipped to the sheriff. The others, menacing and unfriendly, crowded about. "A great day for the box, YB," said Old Man Cook happily. "Search him, Sheriff, and see if he's got it." "Of course he's got it," Star said sternly. "Keep your paws right where they are, outlaw." For the first time, Rip Campbell began to think of the $4,000 in bills he had picked off the desert. Was this the explanation of the trap? In spite of the baking heat, he felt beads of icy perspiration forming on his forehead. That money might be hard to account for. He hadn't been made to dismount, so far. Things had happened too quickly. But his hands were in the air, far from his low-swung, single-action Colt 45s. He had to submit to the search. The sheriff's exploring fingers quickly found the thick roll of bills. His crimson face went hard and grim. "It's here," he announced briefly, and he handed the wad of money to the delighted cook. "Here, count it and see if it's all there." The old rancher ruffled the roll off on a moistened thumb. $2,600, $32, $36, $38, $4,000, he said quickly. Then he turned accusingly to Rip Campbell. "What do you mean by coming to my ranch when I wasn't home, you little sneak, and robbing my wife?" he demanded with indignant contempt. "I didn't," said Rip calmly. He was feeling the coils closing around him, but the feeling that he was innocent brought him quiet courage. "I found this money in a wash, about 15 miles back." The wind. There was a burst of disdainful laughter from the others. Old Cook and his son did not join in, probably because they were too angry. "Found it," repeated Simpson with a hoarse, jeering guffaw. "Can't you think of a better one than that? I suppose the little birds gave it to you." "That isn't far from wrong," Rip said. "The birds were buzzards. I'll tell you just how it happened. I was intending to return this money to its rightful owner, if I could." "You needn't waste your breath telling how it happened," Simpson leered. "You'll need all the breath you have and more when you start swinging from the sheriff's rope." "Campbell, a man answering your description robbed my ranch," said Owens Cook coldly. "Add to that the fact that we found the money on you. What more needs to be said? Sheriff, he's your man, and I'm turning him over to you." Rip saw that he was in a tight spot. Convincing these men of his innocence would be impossible, unless he could get them to accompany him back to the far-distant arroyo. He knew was out of the question. He had been convicted before he opened his mouth. His own reputation was against him. Capture for him meant hanging anyway. "Somebody wore an outfit just like mine to throw the law off the scent," he said. "That's all I can tell you, Sheriff." Owens Cook handed the thick sheaf of greenbacks to his son. "Here, Bill, ride to La Osa with the money until tonight when the time comes to pay the cash over to friend Simpson here," he ordered. "Put it all in the bank," he added. "I ain't trusting these woolsock exchanges anymore." "Okay, Dad," said Bill Cook. With a final dark look at Rip Campbell, he wheeled his pony and clattered off through the sandy wastes in the direction of the town. Sheriff Starr's dry lips cracked into one of his rare grins. "All right, Campbell," he grunted. "Me and you is headed in the same direction. John Law has got you at last." "Won't you let my Beans horse have a drink of water first?" Rip pleaded. He's been over a lot of ground, and he needs it bad. Ordinarily, the sheriff would have granted this request. Now, however, he was in a hurry and in no pleasant frame of mind. Why grant an outlaw anything? "That pony," he said gruffly, "is on the dodge the same as you. I ain't liking him none, he's too good. If it hadn't been for that pinto, you'd have been nabbed long afore this, Campbell. He'll last to La Osa. He ain't suffering none." Rip hid the frosty gleam that came into his boyish blue eyes. He had been about to go peaceably, but now had sparked a flame in the fire of his quick temper. "Fine," he said carelessly. "I'll take a cigarette, Sheriff, and smoke it on the way if you don't mind." Reaching for a smoke is just about the most natural thing in the world. As Rip seemed to have no makings of his own, he lowered one hand and reached toward the sheriff's shirt where the tobacco sack tag still dangled in plain view. The motion appeared to be purely automatic, and Star didn't think to stop him. Instead of pulling out the bag of makings, Rip's hand closed with lightning sureness over the slack of Star's shirt, and grasped him with such force that he pulled him abruptly forward and off his horse. It was the work of a split second. "I'll," began the startled officer, but his words ended in a loud and amazed grunt. Rip whipped him half around, and before the others could bat an eyelash, he had wrenched free Star's big 6-gun. "Stick them up and drop your guns afterward." Rip's cool voice rang out crisply. The faces of the posse were as blank as half-starved statues. James Simpson swore roundly under his breath. But one by one, the heavy revolvers thudded to the ground. The posse's hands went up. Beans, guided by its master's knee, took several slow steps forward and lowered its sleek head. "Right's right, Beans," Rip approved. "Drink and drink hearty. We're going places from here, and fast." While the faithful little animal drank its fill, a smile appeared on the bronzed face of the outlaw. His blue eyes twinkled, and it was easy to see now why they called this bad man Rip Campbell. The bullet scar that marked his rounded cheek looked exactly like a dimple. "Now adios, lawman," Rip sang out as he backed his pony. He backed for 10, 20, 30 yards, then whirled like a flash, his head down and his piebald horse running like a cloud shadow before the wind. In a moment, before the amazed posse could recover its poise, he was gone, swallowed up in the dancing, shimmering waves of desert heat. "Thunderation!" gasped Sheriff Star. "Get your pistols and light out after him. String out. He can't get far. Thank the Maker, I recovered the money he stole anyway," cried Owen's cook, as he scrambled from his heavy roan horse and pawed for his colt. The gloomy deputy heaved a sigh as he turned to his angry chief. "How about returning that silver peso, Star?" he asked mournfully. Star, muttering dire things under his breath, tossed it back to him. "But I'll win it back," he bellowed. "I'll get that Rip Campbell outlaw, if it takes me the rest of my life." Fan-shaped and scattering more and more as they galloped, the sheriff's posse raced in grim pursuit. Chapter 4. Rip Campbell didn't have much trouble shaking off the posse, thanks to Bean's nimble heels. But in ridding himself of that enemy, he found another, the desert, waterless, unconquerable, and without pity. In April, Lizard Sink is hot and desolate; in May, dangerous; but in June, when the desert sun is at its full fury, it is frightful. By noon, the horizons are obscured by a haze like that from a griddle. The very air seemed to curdle in waves. Mirages filled the alkali emptiness of lower ground for many miles, shining and blue with a mocking coolness. Overhead was the sun, a vast seething ball that seared the eyes and cooked the flesh. The few lizards took shelter. It became hotter and hotter with each passing hour. A thermometer would have stood at 120 in the shade, and the cruel lava ground underfoot was burning to the touch. A grayness enveloped every shrinking cactus clump. Here and there, far away, a dust devil smudged the sky, scarcely moving. There was no water for miles, and Rip, for all his desert experience, began to be worried. His own supply was pitifully inadequate, and although Beans could get him through if any horse could, there is a limit to all endurance. From time to time the wind blew, making it seem warmer than ever, and then the sand hissed and whirled like finely powdered emery dust. How many hours or how many miles went by after that scorching noon, Rip was never sure, but suddenly he was positive that he saw something huddled in the sand a quarter-mile from him. A shape that he took at first for a cast-off bundle of clothing. But as he came nearer, he increased his pace to Beans' best. The huddled bundle of clothes was the motionless body of a man. It's the man they called Old Cook," the outlaw muttered. "The Jasper whose money they say I stole." There was no doubt of it, for the aged rancher's face was upturned, blackened now by the sun, and with a swollen and protruding tongue but still recognizable. Rip slid from his horse with an exclamation of pity. Somehow, it seemed, the ranchman had become separated from the rest of the posse, and, weakened by exposure to the heat, had been thrown from his horse. That was the whole grim story as far as Rip could learn, for a hasty examination disclosed no wound of any kind. Rip poured most of his own water supply between the teeth of the dying man, and pulled the heavily breathing figure into the meager shade of a bush. Cook was still alive, though he couldn't have lasted many minutes more without water. His glazed eyes opened a few minutes after the life-giving draught, but he failed to recognize the young hombre who had saved his life. "Thank you," he gasped thickly. "I don't know who you are, but I'm glad you're not that Campbell Jasper. He's a thief, a robber. The sheriff said he's killed 30 men. Stay still," Rip told him gently. "You shouldn't talk any more now. Drink the rest of this, not too fast now." Cook had been engaged in the task of hunting him down, but that didn't make any difference to Rip. He wouldn't have thought of leaving the old rancher there to die in the desert. "Come on, old-timer," he said. "Beans can carry double for a while, even in this heat. Won't you tell me where you live? We've got to have water." "All right," whispered Cook deliriously, "if you'll promise not ever to tell that outlaw Campbell." Sick as he was, he managed to give directions for finding his ranch. The outlaw was relieved to know that it wasn't far, only a matter of 5 miles. Pulling the babbling sufferer up beside him, he made the distance in something over an hour. "There it is again, the old YB," Cook muttered. "It's the ranch that Campbell nearly cheated me out of by taking my mortgage money from me." Just ahead were a few weathered ranch buildings, some of rock, and others of frame and crumbling adobe. A scattering of cottonwood trees grew here, and Rip caught the welcome glint of pure water rippling over the sand below the house. It was just at this point that a glimmering of sanity began to appear in Owens Cook's gray eyes. He shook his head from side to side, then suddenly tried to jump from Beans' back. Rip held him firmly. "It's you, Campbell," the old man gasped. "The outlaw, we." "Sit steady, Pop, I'm a friend," the outlaw told him cheerfully. He held him to the horse's back by sheer force, for they were close to water now and life. "A friend," repeated the rancher scathingly. "You say that," but his struggles were in vain. Rip bore him on resolutely toward the house, the rear of which was shaded by thick trees. Just before he reached it, he heard the horrified scream of a woman. A lady in a gingham sunbonnet, whom he took to be Owens Cook's wife and Bill's mother, came out on the porch wringing her hands. "Owens," she sobbed. "What's the matter?" "He's all right, ma'am, or will be in a few minutes," said Rip, bashfully removing his battered Stetson. "He's badly in need of water, that's all." "Don't let this young coyote in," shouted Old Cook. "He's the one who took our money, Ma. I reckon he's been trying to kill me." To Rip's bewildered pain, the old woman recoiled from him as if he had been some poisonous reptile. "It isn't true, ma'am, and I hope you'll believe me," said the outlaw earnestly. "I found your husband out on the desert, and—" For an old woman, Mrs. Cook had marvelously shrewd eyes. They were deep-set, almost the same gray as her husband's, and were surrounded by humorous, kindly wrinkles. Rip's heart sank when he saw nothing kind in them now. "The same clothes," she said in a dry, even tone. "He's riding the same horse too, it seems to me, and also, wait." For the first time, she had caught a good glimpse of Rip's frank and straightforward face. It was as if she suddenly read the honesty and innocence there. "Tell your story again, my boy," she invited in a more kindly tone. What a detective she would have made, Rip thought. Never once did she take her eyes from Rip's lips while he repeated what he had just said. "Not the same man who robbed the house," she said suddenly and emphatically. "Did you hear that, Owens? Now no more backtalk." The robber was lots older, and his voice was different. He had a handkerchief tied over his mouth, "but you can't fool me." "But this is the worst outlaw in," began the old rancher feebly. "I don't care if he is or not," Mrs. Cook said defiantly. "It's not the man. Now both of you get off that horse and come into the house out of the sun. If you don't, I'll be right out there after you. And if I do, Owens Cook, it'll be the worse for you." A great load seemed suddenly to lift from Rip's heart. It was seldom that anyone spoke kindly to him. Seldom that anyone believed him. If the rest of the posse had come swooping in, he would have fought them with a laugh on his face. Chapter 5. Although the Tin Palace Saloon in La Osa was probably the warmest spot in the town, the drinks it served, and the crooked cards that were sometimes shuffled there made it one of the most popular resorts. It was rumored that James Simpson owned the controlling interest. Be that as it may, Simpson was usually there, if not at the bar, tossing down numberless drinks of tequila sour. He was behind one of the round tables playing his favorite game, poker. "I hear Sheriff Starr's men have come in and have gone again after a few shots of liquor," chuckled Simpson's bar swamper, Max Tuxillo. "Going with them this time?" Simpson shrugged slightly, and the corners of his insolent mouth curled upward. "I've done my bit," he answered. "Why overdo things? If Red Bartlett and the others is in the back room, send them in. I want to talk to them." Tuxillo obediently left the bar and returned in a few minutes, followed by 3 husky, heavily armed desperados. The 3 of them had been in the posse, kindly lent to the manhunt by James Simpson. The first was Red Bartlett, a giant in stature who walked like a gorilla, arms nearly to his knees, but with a certain swinging animal gait. He wore 2 guns, both .44s, and so low that the tips of the scabbards nearly touched the tops of his high black boots. His face rather than his hair gave him his name, for it was reddened to a deep angry scarlet by the desert sun. Ansett and Lem Duncan made up the other 2 of this unwholesome trio. All were professional handlers of the Colt. "Has Agnew showed up yet?" demanded Simpson, as he idly riffled the blue-backed deck of playing cards he held in his long, nervous hands. "Nope, he ain't reported. Didn't you tell him to keep an eye on young Bill Cook?" The saloon man nodded unsmilingly. There was no expression on his swarthy face. "Go get him," he said meaningly. "I want him here in 5 minutes." Red Bartlett put his mouth close to his leader's ear and whispered confidentially. "Agnew says that Bill Cook's about to bank that money like his old man said," he breathed. "But he ain't done it yet." He stopped for a couple of drinks over at Peg Leg's. Simpson gave the cards a vicious shuffle that made them fairly pop. His yellowish eyes glinted under his smooth black brows. "Then tell Agnew to bring Bill with him," he muttered. "Don't let anybody hear the talk, savvy? This business can't wait. I stand a chance to lose the best water between here and the Colorado." The 3 desperados went slinking off like disreputable shadows. They were gone but a short time when they returned with 2 other men. One was Bill Cook, far from intoxicated, but showing in his gray eyes the drink or 2 that he had taken at his journey's end. The other hombre was a small, undersized hombre called Devani. He, too, was a past master with Samuel Colt's invention, and the ivory handles of his 2 guns were carefully notched at least 7 times by means of a file. Fawning, easy to laugh. He was well known in La Osa as an easy hombre with whom to drink or to make a joke. Few guessed the blackness of his real reputation, or that he received $100 a week from James Simpson just to stick around. "Hello, Cook," greeted Simpson with what he intended to be a friendly smile. "Have a chair." "Thanks, I will, James," said young Cook soberly. "Any friend of Dad's is a friend of mine. Heard any news from Campbell? Have they caught him yet?" "Not yet, I believe," smiled Simpson easily, "but they will. You don't know how glad I was that the missing money was recovered." "You could have foreclosed on our property if it had been lost," said Cook, lighting a white paper cigarette from the match that Simpson tendered him. "You surely know me well enough, Bill, that I wouldn't do that," said Simpson. "Was you aiming to go to the bank to deposit that money?" "Yeah, the $4,000 ain't due to you until late tonight, Dad said, according to the agreement," explained young Cook, "and I figured I'd go by his orders. I'll make arrangements to draw the money out again on demand." "You can just give me the money now, lad, and I'll give you a receipt," chuckled the saloon and landowner. "I'm always willing to help out when I can." "No, thanks. I reckon I'll do strictly what Dad allowed I'd better do," said the youthful rancher, getting up from his chair. "I'll go right over and bank it now, and get it done with. I ain't used to going round with so much money in my jeans." A tension somewhat like an electric spark passed between Simpson and his four henchmen. Aside from them and the barkeeper, there was nobody in the saloon. Red Bartlett's face became a drawn mask. Agnew bared his teeth, and Ansett took a deep breath. Duncan's rangy body stiffened, and he seemed to brace himself at the knees. All five men fired at almost the same instant. 5 little spurts of dust flew from Cook's clothing. Some of the slugs struck the young puncher at the belt line. Others ripped through his chest and throat. The very air of the Tin Palace shook as though in a thunderstorm. Red flashes whipped out like streamers. Cook never had time to reach for his own weapon. It was all too unexpected. He hardly knew what had hit him. Death came to him on rushing wings. His bulky, awkward body seemed to fold up, first at the knees, then a hinge seemed to form at his waist. With hardly a sound, he pitched forward toward Simpson's round poker table, just missed it, and landed in a crumpled heap on the floor, his legs trembling a little. "I'll go through him for the money," Simpson breathed as he bent over the tragic figure. He had hardly stopped to holster his smoking gun. "Shot him 5 times, chuckled Bartlett. "There ain't nothing like that to hush an hombre's tongue." Simpson came up with a great sheaf of greenbacks, which he quickly counted. "It's all here, 4,000 even," he announced in a tone of satisfaction. "It's all good," grinned Duncan, snapping open the loading gate of his .44 single action and sliding in a fresh cartridge. "This will need some explaining later, even if the sheriff ain't in town," pointed out Agnew. "What I see, I do not know anything," said the barkeeper, as he poured fresh drinks for the murderers. "It'll need no explaining at all," said Simpson with a knowing wink. He carefully bit the end from a cigar and thrust it between his strong teeth. "Who got the blame for the other job? Savvy what I'm getting at?" "Campbell did, but I still don't see," Bartlett began. "You don't see what become of Stan Eldred, and how Campbell happened to have the money when he was caught?" asked James Simpson. "Neither do I, yet. Maybe Campbell was telling the truth when he told the sheriff he found our man dead at the bottom of a cliff. Anyway, the main thing is we've got the money, and Cook loses his ranch to me forever. That kid outlaw will get the blame for this killing, too. We'll all swear to it." "Agree." The others nodded gleefully. Removing the young rancher's boots with mock ceremony, they picked the body up roughly and carried it out into the hot, dusty, and deserted street of La Osa. "Now what?" Agnew demanded. "Will we wait for the sheriff?" "No," snapped Simpson. "The reason I've got so far in the world is because I've believed in taking the bull by the horns. I've figured that the sheriff will hole up tonight at the YB, whether he happens to catch Campbell or not. Well, we'll take young Cook there to give him something to think about. And that ain't all. Ain't all, repeated Bartlett, in admiration for his leader's sagacity. Nope, we'll just take Judge Carter with us, James Simpson leered. He's a judge of the Superior Court, and if Campbell's caught, we can hold trial. Carter's a judge of the Justice Court too, you see, so? Well, don't you get me? Exclaimed Simpson triumphantly. With him along, he'll have to do his duty, and if old Owens Cook can't pay off his mortgage, well, the YB Ranch will be mine in 2 shakes of a lamb's tail. Come on. Chapter 6. With Beans watered and cared for, and with a good drink of the sweet spring water himself, along with a much-needed wash, Rip Campbell felt like a different man. He almost felt like a free one, instead of a badly wanted fugitive from justice. Mrs. Cook, and her husband too, now that he knew the truth, certainly had a way of making a man feel at home. Then, just as twilight was easing the heat, and when the skies had become painted with the soft, amazing colors of another Arizona sunset, came supper. And what a meal Mrs. Cook cooked! There was corn pone, creamy potatoes, home-baked bread, rich slices of meat, and marvelous gravy. The side dishes were Mexican-style: beans, chili con carne, and tacos. Rip very nearly foundered himself. The thought that his horse, too, was making a luxurious meal outside added to his appetite. "I don't know when I've enjoyed such a supper, ma'am," he told his hostess. "I wish I could stay." "Why couldn't you?" Cook demanded heartily. "I'd be more than glad to give you a job. I know I could trust you with my right arm." The youthful outlaw blushed under all this praise, especially when Mrs. Cook chimed in. But he shook his head. "I'm afraid the law wouldn't leave me alone long enough for me to brand a maverick for you," he smiled. "Every officer in Arizona wants me, dead or alive. I just bring you trouble, but thanks just the same. When supper's over, I'd better slope and put the mountains between me and John Law." "It's been a happy day for us," said Mrs. Cook. "We'd have lost the ranch if you hadn't found the money that robber took. I can hardly wait for Bill to come back. He'll be glad to know you, Rip, when he knows all the truth." "We wouldn't have lost the ranch anyway, Ma," disagreed Owens Cook with his mouth full of food. "I hardly think that James Simpson would have taken it from us, just because the money happened to be stolen." Mrs. Cook's eyes flashed. She thrust her chin out defiantly. "Well, they say there's no fool like an old fool, Owens Cook," she cried scathingly. "That Simpson man doesn't fool me a bit. He'd take our ranch in a minute if he could do it legally. I know snakes when I see them, even if they do go disguised with 2 legs sometimes. He's no good, that man. And I'm glad we're not in his power." "Well, maybe you're right," chuckled the old rancher sheepishly. "I know better than to try and argue with women folks. Anyway, I'll feel a heap better when Bill shows up with the bank's receipt for that money." Rip thought it wise to be on his way again as soon as possible. It was a great surprise, though, when Cook, who was nearest to the kitchen window, gave a cry of alarm. "Here comes some men. Looks like it might be part of the posse." Rip Campbell's rest and food, it seemed, had cost him dear. This probably meant capture. And capture, for him, meant only one thing: lynching. Quickly, he jumped to his feet. There might still be time to reach Beans and get away. But he quickly saw that that was impossible. One glance was enough. Sheriff Starr, already so close that he could be recognized, was pounding in at the head of 4 deputies, most of whom carried short and high-powered Winchester carbines. They were within 200 yards of the house, and coming fast. "It's no use, folks." The youthful outlaw smiled with grim resignation. "I'll have to give myself up. They've got me flat-footed." "They wouldn't have," boomed Cook, "if you hadn't risked your own skin to save mine from the desert this afternoon. It was good of you, lad, and by God they won't have you. Martha, run into my bedroom and fetch the shotgun." Rip wouldn't listen to it. "I won't have you risking yourself for me, Mr. Cook," he said quietly. "There's no chance anyway, and you'd only get yourself shot up. But think of Mrs. Cook, Rip reminded him grimly. Where there's a woman and lead flying. Now don't mind me, Rip, said Mrs. Cook just as firmly. I'd just as soon give up my own son. I'll settle this, folks, said Rip, his eyes suddenly misty with unaccustomed tears. He couldn't have these people risking their all for the sake of a wanted man. Before they could stop him, he stepped coolly from the kitchen door into the open with his hands over his head. Hands up, kid, shouted Sheriff Starr at the top of his lungs as he slid his horse to a stop. He dismounted with his right hand locked inside the lever of a .30 to 30 Winchester. The sights were in line. The others, too, lost no time in getting the drop, and getting it fast. We've got you covered, called out the gloomy deputy. I ain't disputing it, Rip drawled, allowing his own .45s to remain in their holsters. His hands were up. Wait a minute, dang you all, roared Cook. I'm a-meaning you, Sheriff Starr. How'd this kid get here? The sheriff wanted to know, breathlessly. I ain't going to let you take him until I tell you he's innocent of the charges I pressed on him. The rancher exploded. Come on into the house while I explain. If it wasn't for Campbell, I'd be dead. The sheriff and his men were very cool as they came up on the porch and took Rip in charge. This time Starr was careful to take Rip's 2.6 guns. You won't bum no cigarette from me this time, young feller, he frowned. Rip chuckled. I never smoke, Sheriff, he said. That's why you should have been on your guard this morning. I won't pull that again. No, and you won't pull any other tricks either, said Starr decisively. Don't take your eyes off him, men. When they were back inside the kitchen, the men with drawn guns ranged themselves up against one wall. Cook told his story quickly, but the sheriff wasn't much impressed. Well, Owens, Starr announced when he had heard it all, I'll admit that Campbell did a very commendable thing. I admit there's good in him. But that don't hardly alter matters, see. There's been a dead or alive reward a hanging over young Campbell for many a moon. He's a gunman, and he's got to pay the extreme penalty. But hey, who's this coming? 4 or 5 fellers. Why, it's James Simpson and his men. Deputy Sutter exclaimed. They're carrying somebody with them on an extra horse. Whoever he is, he looks like he's messed up bad. Why, it's your boy Bill, Mr. Cook, he blurted. It was hardly a tactful thing to say. The old rancher's moon-like face turned 3 shades whiter under its layer of sunburn. His lips moved, but for a moment no sound came. Bill, he repeated. Not Bill. As for Mrs. Cook, the boy's mother, she took it with all the stoicism of a frontierswoman. They saw her take a step backward, one hand twisting at her apron. Aside from that, she did not yet betray the emotion within. I'm sorry, said the sheriff in his blundering, sympathetic way. I hope it ain't nothing serious. Maybe he fell off his horse or something. He blinked out of the doorway, one eye on his prisoner. Who is that with them? He demanded, as another rider swung into view, a far from expert horseman who seemed to have some difficulty in staying on his horse. Even at that distance they could see that his hair and beard were white. Looks like Judge Carter. It is Judge Carter, sang out one of the other deputies wonderingly. Wonder what he's here for. I'm afraid something dreadful has happened, said Mrs. Cook in a voice that appeared calm and steady. It was the first thing she had said, and somehow betrayed the turmoil within. The little party dismounted outside, and slowly, almost like pallbearers at a Boot Hill funeral. The 4 Simpson henchmen carried their motionless burden toward the house. Owens Cook passed a large, trembling hand over his face. I see you've got Campbell, came James Simpson's exulting voice. He had evidently seen Rip's pony outside and recognized it. Never mind about Campbell, cried the old rancher almost fiercely. His voice seemed to come from a point deep underground and far away. Bill. That's Bill, ain't it? Is he dead? Simpson's upturned mustache ends turned down in a mock expression of grief. He shook his head sadly. I'm afraid he is, he said with a nod toward Mrs. Cook. Cook slumped back against the oilcloth-covered table and clutched it to keep from staggering. Mrs. Cook gave one low moan but did not faint, although her face became ashen in hue. Rip's heart went out to both of them. Already he had learned to think of this splendid old couple as toward his own mother and father, whom he did not remember. So few people had been good to him. Who did it? Old Cook gasped. Then Rip got one of the most unpleasant starts in his life. Simpson, showing his pointed teeth in a coyote smile, pointed a long and accusing finger. The kid you're feeding and making up to, he leered. Rip Campbell. Chapter 7. There was a silence that must have lasted nearly a minute, broken only by the old rancher's heavy breathing. Then he flared. I don't believe it. We have witnesses, chuckled Pascal. He did it all right. Shot Bill 5 times, stole the money, every cent of it. But I mean he's been here for supper most of the afternoon, blurted Cook. He's saved. This happened right afore noon, grinned Simpson, giving Rip a wolfish stare. He had plenty of time afore he even come this away. He's got no alibi. Why, the thing happened right in my saloon. I seen it with my own eyes. I tried to drop Campbell, but he was too fast for me. I saw it too, chimed in Red Bartlett. Campbell, he'd done it. Held us all off with his guns while he took the 4,000 in money. The rancher shook his head in bewilderment and turned to Judge Carter, who had just entered the room. There was an appealing look in his eyes. There was even more than that in Rip's heart. To be accused of such a thing, and so brazenly, made him physically sick. There was just one bright ray of light in all the gloom that had enveloped his soul. That was the fact that Cook didn't believe him a murderer. Half turning, he faced the dead boy's mother. And you, ma'am, he asked falteringly, do you think Mrs. Cook gave Rip one look, and after that he would have cheerfully met whatever fate had been prepared for him, however cruel. I don't believe it, she said. Well, I do, said the sheriff. How about it, Judge? Judge Carter cleared his throat impressively and adjusted his black string tie. Childish, Carter had been called, but nobody in La Osa would have admitted that he was ignorant of law. He had served once, it was said, in Washington, a congressman. There was little of the former dignity left. He was shriveled, flabby, thin in spots, and bloated in others. He liked whiskey not wisely, but too well. Still, in spite of it all, there was something in him that commanded respect. They listened for what he had to say. I wasn't there, wasn't a witness neither in facto nor pro tem, so to speak, so I couldn't speak without the benefit of habeas corpus. Nevertheless, my friends, the evidence sounds to me pretty conclusive. James Simpson and Red Bartlett, parties of the first part, will you raise your right hands and solemnly swear that you saw Rip Campbell, the present prisoner you see before you, willfully shoot, murder, and otherwise kill the said? Please cut it short, Judge, pleaded the old ranchman. Carter ignored the interruption. Will you solemnly swear that you saw Rip Campbell fire upon and kill Bill Cook? We swear, said Simpson and his red-faced henchmen, raising their right paws. And we swear, too, added Agnew and Duncan. As the judge said, it looked conclusive. Already, the sheriff was exchanging meaning glances with his men, and Deputy Sutter was coiling a long section of lariat rope. Not aimlessly either, for in the end he had carefully made a hangman's noose. You have a nice stand of cottonwood trees here, ain't you, Cook? Starr said pointedly. The rancher lifted his suffering, seamed face from his son's dead face to Rip's horrified one, and then back to the sheriff. You ain't going to hang Campbell on my place without a decent trial, he thundered. And maybe not then. Then, said Simpson icily, how about hanging him here on mine? Yours. Cook repeated mechanically. Yeah, nodded James Simpson, twisting his lip mockingly. The mortgage is past due this minute. Have you got the money to pay it? Interest and all, it amounts to 4,000 even. So that's it, blared the rancher. You'd rob me of my place. Call it robbery if you like. I'll leave it to the judge, returned Simpson with a slight shrug. You should have thought of that when you signed this here mortgage paper. From his breast pocket he took a document and laid it face up on the table, under Judge Carter's nose. The judge adjusted his glasses and examined the date. I don't see anything wrong with this, or why James shouldn't foreclose, decided the legal light of La Osa. Can you pay up, Owens? Of course I can't, said the rancher, turning purple. Luckily, I've got my stamper with me, said Carter, fumbling in the pocket of his black alpaca coat and taking out an official seal. I'll just make over the ranch to Simpson while I'm here, just to be fair and legal, pro tem. That's good, laughed Simpson loudly. He was in great good humor now. But how about having Campbell's trial first? It won't take long. The first thing I want to do, after the ranch is mine, is to hang Campbell from one of my choice trees. Rip looked at the cooks, filled with an infinite pity. He was not sorry for himself. His had been a hard and dangerous life, and his own plight didn't shake his nerve. But to have these two old people lose their little rancho, just after losing what they loved most, their son, that was too much. He felt his breath coming in long, angry gasps, felt his nails biting deep into the palms of his hands. If only he had his guns, or one tiny chance to right what he believed to be a wrong. What have you to say for yourself, Campbell? Judge Carter demanded. The circumstances are a little unusual, but I'm a duly recognized authority of this state, and Superior Court is now in session. Quiet, please. The only thing I have to say is that I'm innocent, said the outlaw, looking the judge steadily in the face. This isn't much of a trial, sir. Carter smiled wryly, as if something hurt him. He was never a pleasant man. Carefully, he wiped his steel-rimmed glasses. As far as that goes, Campbell, you're not entitled to a trial at all. Sentence of death, if I remember the legal papers rightly, have been passed on you at Tucson, Globe, Flagstaff, Nogales. A man has a right to clear his name before he dies, said Rip Campbell quietly. He was watching Deputy Sutter, coiling and uncoiling the lynching rope. Is that right, Your Honor? Correct, according to the law of ex post facto, admitted the learned judge. Very well then, said the outlaw coolly. It's been claimed that Bill Cook was shot 5 times. Did you see the bullets personally, Judge? See them? Snorted Carter. I've got them. I happen to be coroner of La Osa, as well as judge. I removed them, their slugs, as evidence. Carter carefully took a red bandana from his pocket and unrolled it. Inside were 5 leaden objects, most of them quite smooth, but some bent and battered a little. The murdered boy's mother took away her eyes, and Cook swore softly under his breath. Without touching them, Rip bent forward and took one look. Those are all 44s, he said quietly. 3 Colts and 2 S&W. Admitted, said the judge with dignity. Seems to me, Rip drawled, his youthful face a mask, that Senor Simpson and all his men use that caliber. Very funny, isn't it? I always use 45s, always have. There was a muttered oath from Simpson, and the sheriff's eyes went round and wide with unbelief. Why, kid, that ain't so, he accused. You use a 44. Those are the guns I... Let me show you I'm right, Rip smiled. Unthinking, Starr passed over first one of the outlaw's 6 guns to Rip, and then the other. And he was so obliging as to hand them out butts first. Now you see, Rip chuckled, that this is a 45. And so is this, and put them up, all of you. Stand right where you are. Chapter 8. The sheriff's mouth came open wide. He blinked like an owl caught out at noon. Rip had promised not to use the cigarette trick on him, but he had used another. And he was caught flat-footed. Don't shoot, Campbell, Starr wheezed. The others, too, had no time to reach for their hardware. They hadn't expected such a boner from Starr, nor had they expected Rip to be so quick to take advantage of it. One by one, their empty hands went toward the low ceiling. For the first time, a slow grin had dawned on Owens Cook's face. "I reckon I've proved I didn't kill Bill Cook," said Rip easily. "Any arguments?" Nobody spoke. Simpson's face was black with fury, but he lacked the nerve to start the fire flying. His henchmen swore and wilted. Already it was almost dark outside. Rip slowly backed toward the door, his twin gun muzzles seeming to cover each man alike. Suddenly, Rip blew out the oil lamp that had been lighted just a few minutes before. It plunged the room in semi-darkness. "Don't be in a hurry to follow me, friends," Rip warned pleasantly, "or there'll be some more slugs for the judge to put in that red bandana of his." The door slammed shut with such force that every man jumped almost out of his boots, thinking a gun had exploded. Then they all blinked. Rip Campbell had gone. After the little whelp, snarled James Simpson. 500 cash to the man that gets him. They rushed outside, or most of them did, but there was little to be seen. A black and white Pinto moved through the gloom, gray and indistinct now in the dark, that was all. Bang. Several Sook's guns and a Winchester cracked, but as far as results went, they might have been shooting at the stars overhead. Then someone lighted the lamp again, and there was an amazed yell from Judge Carter. "The paper, the mortgage paper, gone!" he shrieked. "What?" squalled James Simpson, turning in a rage. There was no doubt about it. A few moments before, the official-looking document had been reposing on the kitchen table. Now it had vanished without a trace. "Why, the thief!" screamed Simpson in a fuming passion. "The sneaking little thief! I'll double that reward. I'll triple it." There were more shouts without effect. "He's down by Cook's old bunkhouse," shouted Deputy Sutter, breaking into a run. "Stop there." "You're crazy," howled the sheriff. "What in thunder would he want there?" They investigated all the same, but they were slow and cautious. None were overanxious to face Rip's guns if it came to an abrupt showdown. When they reached the old bunkhouse, they found nobody, but one of the deputies was positive that he saw a rapidly moving shape just running away from it. Rip's horse. They fired at it, but only succeeded in wasting good ammunition. "It's no go," grumbled the sheriff. "I feel like kicking myself from here to Phoenix. Twice I had him and he's gone. No moon tonight, and we'll have to wait and track him in the morning." Morning came, however, with no sign of the outlaw or his spotted horse. Hating to face another scorcher in the desert, the sheriff disconsolately returned to La Osa, leaving his 3 deputies to carry on the search. At noon, Starr went to Pegleg's bar for a drink, staying longer than he intended, and returned to his tiny white-painted office at 3:45. He found 2 letters waiting for him. The first didn't add anything to Starr's cheerfulness. It was from the gloomy deputy, and read as follows. "Dear Sheriff, still no sign of Campbell and the piebald jackrabbit he's riding. Remember the silver peso I bet against 2 bits? Pay me. 2 bits is worth a shot of Cascade, and if you're a sport you'll throw in a dime cigar. Yours respectfully, Sutter." "Thunderation," growled the sheriff, adding something not quite polite. Then he opened the second letter. Who had brought it he had no way of knowing, but the writing was in an unfamiliar, boyish scrawl. He read it thoughtfully. "Come to the Tin Palace this evening at 9 for a poker game. Lead chips might be used, so it might be best for you to stay out. Keep your hands empty and your eyes and ears open. A friend." Now, I wonder what the devil that means. Starr ejaculated, scratching his head and half closing his eyes. "I know that Simpson is great on poker, but, well, I'm going to be on hand anyway." 7 o'clock came, then 8. Things began to be more lively at the Tin Palace saloon. The scrapings of a fiddle were heard. Glasses began to clink against the bottles on the long bar. Mingled with the talk of booted men came the soft rattle of chips and the purr of a roulette ball as it whizzed over the wheel of chance. Simpson might have lost the YB Rancho, but he certainly intended to recoup his fortunes. "Look what I found in the desert, Chief," whispered Devani, coming close to his leader's chair, just as the games were opening up. "You're sunk as far as Cook's Ranch is concerned." He handed James Simpson a tiny bit of paper, a piece no larger than the end of the gambler's thumb. Simpson scowled at it. On it the words could just barely be made out. 12 months after date, we, the undersigned. "It's all that's left of the promissory note of Cook's," the desperado breathed in Simpson's ear. "Campbell burned it, tearing it up first. This is all of it now, you'll never collect." Simpson ground his teeth together with anger. The veins stood out in his forehead like swollen cords. "What business was it of his?" he snarled, half aloud. "Cheated me out of it. If I ever catch that kid, I'll—" He didn't finish, but the master gambler's hard face was expressive enough. At that moment, the wide saloon doors swung open, and a newcomer entered, lugging a handsome saddle mounted with shells and silver butterflies, a beautiful specimen of the saddler's art. Simpson glanced at him, and his brows lowered somewhat. "It's only a kid," grinned Devani. "Stole the saddle, more than likely." Simpson grinned, nodded, and shuffled his cards invitingly. He was alone at his round table, and he wasn't averse to receiving stolen goods occasionally, if it were profitable enough. The kid with the saddle seemed hardly more than a boy. His swarthy face was rather pleasing, especially when he smiled and showed his white teeth, which he was doing now as he advanced straight toward Simpson's table. He wore 2 guns, but no man of Simpson's type thought anything of that. He knew that few hombres south of the Rio know how to use a Colt. The kid came on through the crowd, still carrying the saddle. He was dressed in a rough brown shirt, open at the throat, and a very battered black sombrero. "Where have I seen that fellow afore?" muttered Simpson. Devani, Red Bartlett, Duncan, and Ansett were standing close to their chief's chair. They laughed contemptuously. "More fodder for your mill, that's all," chuckled Red. "You ain't never seen the kid afore. They all look alike, anyway." "What do you want, kid?" demanded Simpson insultingly, as the lad halted with his saddle. "Me like play poker very much," was the smiling reply. The 4 gunmen burst into guffaws, while Simpson gave his chair a hitch and surveyed his victim with a businesslike smirk. "But why?" he asked smoothly. "Me, I have not much money," admitted the youth. "But this saddle, I play with it." The gambler looked at the saddle, taking care not to display too much interest. But he could hardly help it. The hull was easily worth a couple of hundred, second-hand. It was literally encrusted with silver. "You steal them, huh?" sneered Simpson. "I no play with thieves." "No, it's mine," was the cool reply. "I play you $100. $100 for that wreck?" jeered Simpson with a sly wink at his henchman behind him. "Tell you what I'll do, kid. I'll play you 50. One hand." "I play," said the youthful Mexican, and the poker game, the game that was to become history in La Osa, began. Chapter 9. Poker with James Simpson was more than a business. It was an art, a passion. He sincerely thought himself unbeatable. Not that he was an honest gambler. Simpson was honest only when it was policy to be on the square, and that was seldom. Confidently, he shuffled the cards and extended the deck to the young man, who dropped his saddle to the floor beside his chair and regarded his opponent with a quiet smile. "Low card deals?" queried the owner of the Tin Palace. "Fine," agreed the youth from below the border, and promptly cut a king. Simpson laughed and cut a 4-spot. He dealt. The game was draw jacks or better to open, and the first winning hand took the saddle, or the $50. The kid scarcely glanced at his cards and then passed, as did Simpson. The deal went around again, then Simpson passed, and the unknown stranger opened the pot. He drew 3 cards. The gambler took 1. "Aces up," chuckled James Simpson when the deal was over. "What you call dos, no trace queen." 3 queen, said the young man, and the $50 was his. "Lucky." snarled Simpson between his pursed lips. "You won't last long, my friend. Better lose and have it over." But the young man didn't lose. He won the next hand, and then with the stakes doubled, the next. Soon he had $600 in a neat pile before him, all in green and yellow bills, some 10s, some 20s, and several 50s. "Hello, Sheriff," called Simpson, looking up as a new arrival quietly took a seat near the table. "Howdy," grunted Starr, rolling a cigarette with his eyes on the riffling cards. "How's the game?" "Oh, it's about over," laughed Simpson, and at the very next hand he opened, and when the young man stayed, raised him $200. To his amazement, the swarthy youth thrust in a big sheaf of bills. "Me raise again," he said cheerfully. "Me like to play poker." That kid lad could certainly play poker. A crowd had formed about the table, and for the first time Simpson felt worried. This was getting to be a big game, even for the Tin Palace. In a very little while, the youth had $2,000 before him, all in banknotes. Simpson's face was wet with sweat under his green eyeshade, and his smile was forced. He licked his lips frequently. The four gunmen behind his chair edged closer, their faces hard. "I'm laying down there. Show your openers and win," snapped Simpson savagely a minute later. "I've only got 3 little 3s. "One pair jacks me," said the Mexican softly, and Simpson stiffened with suppressed rage. Beaten again, and all the time he had held the best hand. The sheriff bent forward interestedly, some of the time watching the cards, and sometimes the players. His face was blank with astonishment. Then came the time when the lad had $3,000 in bills neatly stacked at his elbow. Once again the cards were dealt, and Simpson's hand was shaking a little. Twice he almost bobbled. "I opened this pot," announced the swarthy youth without changing expression. Simpson smiled quietly to himself. He had meant it that way. In spite of his nervousness, he had placed the pasteboards where he wanted them. With studied carelessness, he looked at his own hand, examining the cards one at a time between his long and sensitive fingers. "I guess I'll stay with you if you crack it, kid," he replied, his voice deliberate and without a tremor. "How many cards you taking?" "I play these," drawled the young Mexican. The newly lighted cigar almost fell from Simpson's mouth. The muscles of his face twitched. With one hand he rubbed the cold perspiration from his eyes, then looked again at his own cards. Red Bartlett, Ansett, Duncan, and Agnew looked over his shoulder. He had 3 aces. But the Mexican, it seemed, had a pat hand. 1,000 more was in the pot now. If the boy won, he'd have 4,000 American dollars. And how could Simpson hope to win, bucking a pat hand, a hand that needed no additional cards, with just 3 aces? James Simpson studied, swore, studied again, and then flung his hand to the floor with an exclamation that made the rafters ring. "You blasted lucky bastard, take the money. I'm out. What have you got, straight or a flush?" Unsmilingly, the Mexican turned just 2 kings face up on the table. He had won with another stupendous bluff. Simpson glared at the cards and went a sickly white. He bit his lip and seemed to sag down in his chair, his eyeshade going crooked over one ear. He looked across at the $4,000 stacked in front of the young man, and fairly gnashed his teeth. Then he felt the slight pressure of a knee at his back. It was Red Bartlett, and he knew what that signal meant. It wasn't often that a stranger, and a kid at that, was allowed to get out of the Tin Palace with 4,000 in real winnings. Men had been killed for less than that. James took a deep breath and turned his head toward Tuxillo, the bartender, behind him. He made his voice steady. He knew what was coming, or thought he did. "Bring us some hot ones," he said casually. It was the long agreed-upon countersign. It meant gunplay. Almost at the same instant, Devani, Bartlett, Duncan, and Ansett reached for their 6 guns. Chapter 10. The crowd, even the sheriff, dropped low, for they saw the storm coming even before the lightnings of death and the thunders of destruction began to crackle. Already the big oversized .44s of the murderous quartet were flashing from their well-greased holsters. Even Simpson's twitching white hand went for the gun at his belt. But none of them dreamed that the youth could be so fast, so bewilderingly quick. Even before the signal for the fight had been given, he had thrust the money safely away. As Simpson cried out, he leaped forward like a catapult, overturning the round poker table and sending Simpson sprawling like a roped maverick. Bang! Ansit's blue six-gun streaked crimson flame. So close was the range that it seemed to lick at the front of the lad's shirt. Strange to say, though, that shot had been too slow. Even as he fired it, the man's twin .45s came ripping from the leather, barking almost before the muzzles were clear. Ansit's chin went toward his knees, and he seemed to fold up into an absurd ball, rolling to the floor head first, gun clattering from his nerveless hand. The bullet that had stricken him had ranged upward from his midriff and emerged from his shoulder blades. And almost before the deafening roar of the explosion shook the tin palace, Red Bartlett dropped. He had been in the act of firing, and the other slug had torn through his gun hand into his side, penetrating his heart. The red-faced giant never knew what had hit him. As if jerked upward by an invisible rope, he seemed for a brief instant to be trying to crawl into the ceiling. His flushed head was back, his mouth open. Then, as if the spell had been broken, he fell with a jar that shook the building and rattled the bottles on the bar. Then, and not until both men had sagged down, were the spectators conscious of smoke. It had rolled up in a thick blue cloud, motionless and greasy like cigar smoke. The echoes of the shots came together like the splitting thunder of an avalanche. "Look out, he's..." "Burn the kid up." "He's no kid." Duncan's gun spat yellow flame, sending sparks flying as if from an emery wheel. But the target had moved on, considerably. Leaping nimbly to one side, the swarthy-faced youth fired twice, while Duncan's bullet crashed violently through the nearest window. Duncan seemed to laugh. That laugh, though, was only the hole left by a bullet. That horrible crimson grin was still on his evil features when he went staggering forward on his face, arms outstretched. That young man had blue eyes. Nobody had noticed it before, but they were shining now with a fighting light. "You coyotes," he said, and there was no hint of accent in his voice now, as it rang over the pounding of the guns. It was Devani's chance for glory. He had won many a gunfight, had this smart, swart, black-haired man. From El Paso to Yuma, his name was feared. Already his carved ivory-butted Colts were out, and he had dropped back at a crouch to sweep the unknown Mexican with fire and lead. But vivid streaks of orange-red danced then from the twin bores of the youth's .45s. Agnew turned half around, as the lead played in a molten tattoo across the front of his gay cowboy shirt. He coughed, and his face became distorted and gray with agony. Without a word he went careening into the wall, striking it with one shoulder and the side of his face. Then he fell into a quivering heap, his clothing literally smoking. "Drop it," the lad snapped, as Simpson whirled up to face him with a drawn pearl-handled, short-barreled pistol in his shaking fingers. Smash! Instead of firing on James Simpson, the swarthy youth hit him with his right hand, gun and all. It was a terrific blow, and the saloon man went down like a chopped tree. His chair crashed to smithereens, the table broke in bits, and cards flew everywhere, like dry leaves blowing through the smoke. Simpson landed with a thud, his head sloping over on one side, and a thin drool of scarlet appearing beneath the trim corners of his mustache. His eyes remained half open, the look of amazed fear still in them. "Do you know me now?" drawled the youth. "I seldom play cards, and when I do it's for a purpose, understand." There was a ring in that voice that Simpson had heard before. Now, even in his half-delirium, it floated into his brain. That voice, that boyish smile. "Rip Campbell." He spat out through swollen lips. "Good," nodded the youngster. "Those clothes I borrowed at the YB bunkhouse, plus a little walnut juice on my face and hands worked wonders, didn't it?" I reckon now that I've won back the money that rightfully belongs to Pa and Ma Cook." Simpson stared in unbelief. His eyes looked like two cigarette holes in a horse blanket. "But you—" "I'm a poor poker player," said Rip cheerily, "and that's how I beat you. An honest man can sometimes beat a shark. All I did was to lay them down when you dealt me good ones, and to play the poor hands strong. That's what crossed you up. You thought you was wrong, and I had you guessing all the time." There was an oath from James Simpson. It brought another fiery gleam to Rip's clear blue eyes. "And you're going to tell the sheriff here who killed Bill Cook?" he cried. Simpson clicked his jaws shut. "I won't." Rip stepped forward and made a swift pass with the sight of one of his Colt's single actions. A crimson welt appeared at the gambler's throat. He emitted a piercing scream. "He's killed me. He cut my throat," he gurgled. "I'm a-going to die. I'll tell. I'll tell. I had it framed all along. I had one of my men dressed like Campbell to rob the YB. When that failed, I had Bill killed. I helped kill him." "That's enough," Rip drawled, turning half to the amazed Sheriff Starr with his 2.6 guns still in his brown hands. "Heard it, didn't you, Sheriff? Well, I'm turning him over to you. His throat isn't cut, just sore. If you'll adjust the knot just a half-inch higher, he won't even notice it. I'll have something interesting for you at your office a little later, Sheriff. In the meantime, adios." A gasp went up from the fearful spectators at the Tin Palace. Rip Campbell had picked up his silver-mounted saddle and was out of the big room at one bound. Sheriff Starr's nerves were still crawling a little when he entered his office 10 minutes later, after jailing James Simpson for murder. Gingerly, he opened the door half ajar. The inside was dark. He listened but heard nothing. "Is anyone there?" he stuttered. He almost jumped entirely off the sidewalk when he heard footsteps behind him. Then he heaved a sigh of relief and fumbled for the reassuring comfort of a roll-your-own cigarette. "That you, Sutter?" he blurted. "Yep," admitted the deputy, who had just come into view behind him. "Say, I just heard all about it. Wish I'd been there. Talk about smoking them up. Say." "Yes, I wish you'd been there too," admitted the sheriff as he mopped the icy perspiration from his forehead. "Come on into the office with me, will you, Sutter? I'm still jumpy." The two men went in. A match was struck, and Sutter held the flame to the wick of an old oil lamp. He drew back with a jump. "Look here," he cried. "It's money, Starr, piles of it. And here's a note with it. Looks like it's been writ with the lead end of a bullet. What does she say?" "I'll SSC," stammered Starr, holding the letter, which had been boyishly scrawled on the back of an old envelope, to the light. Starr noted with a start that it was the same writing he had seen earlier in the evening. This time, though, it wasn't signed. The scrawl read as follows: "Sheriff, this money, 4,000 even, belongs to Cook of the YB Ranch. See that he gets it pronto, or I'll chase the law some instead of having it chase me. Rip Campbell." "Well, I'll be," began Deputy Sutter. "That's what I call a weird kind of outlaw." "What are you doing, Starr?" Sheriff Starr had gone to the wall and was looking over the long line of reward posters that decorated it. He halted in front of one of the largest of them. It bore this heading in large black letters: "Wanted, Rip Campbell dead or alive." The sheriff took a pencil and deliberately crossed out the fourth and fifth words. He crossed them out and kept crossing them out until nothing could be seen of them. Then, deliberately and with a heavy hand, he printed, before the final word, "Still. And I ain't saying I'm sorry either," he grunted as he looked over his handiwork. The end.